James McNeill Whistler, Whistler, the sophisticate and also the continental American painter, influenced more by European styles, but still maintained his American individualism. Portraits and landscapes of cool, muted, close blendings of tones. Slide, please. Albert Pinkham Ryder, R-Y-D-E-R. His paintings sort of developed into large, blobby, abstracted shapes, whether they were boats, religious figures, opera figures, or figures from literature. Slide, please. Winslow Homer, H-O-M-E-R, depicted man's fight against nature, one of America's greatest watercolorists, outdoor painter, mostly of seascapes around Maine and then the Bahamas, but of a nature subject. Slide, please. John Sloan, S-L-O-A-N, depicted the ordinary genre scenes of New York City life, usually on the tenement section or the lower east side. They were done in sort of an impressionistic manner, but they showed people sort of about everyday activities. Slide, please. Georgia O'Keeffe was one of the first modern American painters, O-K-E-E-F-F-E, mostly landscape or nature patterns, flowers, skulls, hills, valleys, clouds, done in a crisp-edged, abstract formula. Slide, please. Grant Wood was a mid-1930 American painter who depicted America's attitude toward the Midwest, the abundance of the American farmland. His farms were highly stylized, sort of balloon effects, everything very curving, full-blown, in crisp-edged, stylized patterns. Slide, please. Stuart Davis, another modern American abstractionist, D-A-V-I-S, used contemporary symbols and forms in brilliantly, artificially colored flat pattern abstractions. Slide, please. Edward Hopper, H-O-P-P-E-R, an American realist painter who depicted sort of a small city life, the loneliness of the people living there in sort of strong, spotlighted, shadow, sun-drenched compositions. Slide, please. And Andrew Wyeth, W-Y-E-T-H, probably the greatest living American realist painter, painting within small confines of Pennsylvania and New England, presenting normal, everyday subjects in very austere, simple, elegant compositions, mostly in browns and whites and soft earth tone effects. The underlying theme of his paintings is death. Clear the machine, please.
Slide, please. And the primitive artist, naive, untrained, presented an idyllic, charming view of the early United States. Clear the machine, please.
L-L-O-C-K. Put in the first slide, please. This is a photograph of Jackson Pollock in front of one of his paintings. There was a great change in the art world with the upheaval of the Second World War. Prior to this, as we have talked about some of the other artists, beginning with John Sloan in the Ashcan group around the turn of the century, where subject matter became sort of everyday life subject matter. This was sort of added to in the 1930s with the financial depression in the United States, where we retreated inward. And instead of the popular artists being from the big cities, the sophisticated cities on the eastern seaboard, it was a return to artists like Grant Wood, who expressed the abundance, the heartland of the United States, the farming area. And so the art world really retreated inward physically, where many of the artists were in the middle United States rather than in New York City. With the WPA projects and sort of a social attitude toward art, it was highly restrictive on these artists, on their creativity. Painting murals of historical scenes or painting murals dedicated to industry on post office walls and on train station walls. There was a great inhibitive feeling placed on the artist in the 1930s. The Second World War period, of course, expanded our vision tremendously, all in sort of one sudden jolt. And certainly the fever of the United States was not an artistic fever at that time. But anyway, there were currents brewing, and as most art history periods, as we know, the artist reflects the life in which he lives. This turmoil was sort of boiling within the artist, especially in the New York school, during the period of the early 40s and late 40s after they returned from the armed forces. Most of them had studios or large factory lofts around 10th Street in New York, the Soho district. These huge warehouse studios offered them large areas, unrestricted areas, where they could paint, and they sort of understood what each other was trying to do. From this period, they each developed an individual style, and yet, within the framework, the general framework of all of the artists, there was this sort of distinct feeling of an absolute freedom from any inhibitions placed on them by anybody. They were solely on their own. And with Hans Hofmann's school in Greenwich Village of complete abstractions where emotions could take over, of where he introduced what was called action painting, of where the paintings became big, the sweep of the arm, the freedom of just really flinging paint, the absolute freedom took over. And literally, this is what Jackson Pollock did in the late 40s and early 50s. He developed a very and extremely personal style of painting that you see behind him. Slide, please. In a series of photographs taken in his studio of him at work. But he would stretch these tremendous sizes of canvas out on the floor. It was new enamels that were introduced during the wartime, but enamels that had not been known of before, these synthetic-based enamels in gold and silvers and shiny blacks and brilliant colors. He would take these and by splattering them using sticks, brushes, pouring them directly from the can of paint, work around this canvas that was laid out on the floor. He said, he really felt in the painting because he worked on all sides. There is a certain amount of control, your choice of color, your choice of paint for one thing, and just sort of the directions and the amount of paint that you splatter or spill on this surface. He would build up layers of these splatters on top of one another so that it became a very lacy effect, almost like a spider web of little traceries of paint. Then the whole thing would be allowed to dry on the horizontal surface, and then, after it was dry, stretched and hung on a vertical surface, so that these delicate traceries of paint would defy gravity by not sliding down the wall, but remain in this sort of gravity-defying position, sort of as a spider web is delicately hung by unseen little threads amongst the bushes outdoors. Slide, please. Pollock took a tremendous amount of criticism on his artwork, and probably the notoriety hurt him more than it helped him. He was first given showings by Peggy Guggenheim in her very avant-garde gallery called Art of This Century, which she opened in New York following the Second World War. Also, these artists, to be able to really feel of getting into the painting, the size became tremendous. Now think of the importance of Pollock in relationship to the development of art. With the beginning of Renaissance and the introduction of perspective and the rules of perspective, you could reduce a whole cityscape to a mere 8 inches if you wanted to. Although it may look real, it would be very unreal, being such a miniature sort of a thing. So the whole feeling of the Renaissance was this manipulation of an illusion on a flat surface, making a flat surface look round or look to have depth, which it actually didn't have. Then with Cézanne, going back to a destruction of this flat surface, of where he would reverse perspective and have apples nearly rolling off the table, and going back to a more geometric feeling, and then finally to Picasso with Cubism, of where the pictorial quality no longer existed in the painting. In other words, the artists were no longer interested in, say, producing, quote, a picture. They were painting, they were creating directly on the canvas. With the Cubism, it was a manipulation of shapes, of forms. Sort of like a mathematician can work an extremely difficult math problem, not necessarily knowing what the answer is going to be or having any interest in what the answer is to be, but just the machinery of working out a problem is what interests him. This is then what interested the artist, of creating a surface, not a picture any longer. With Pollock, all thoughts of perspective have been erased completely. A splatter is as big as a splatter. You cannot reduce it, you cannot enlarge it. It is a life-size thing. I mean, you can pour more paint and make a bigger blob, or you can drizzle little bitty paint, but they are actual size. They cannot be tampered with. They cannot be reduced, or they cannot. So it is a very human size art. It relates to the human being, which is very important with these large canvases of the abstract expressionist painters. Slide, please. The abstract expressionist painters, it's a term designated to these artists following the Second World War, is a combination of abstract painting that was introduced basically by Cézanne, then carried on by Picasso and many of the artists in the 19-teens and the 1920s, and then the expressionists, of where a tremendous amount of emotion would come out. So it's a term, abstract art, where the subject is either abstracted or there's no subject at all, such as in Pollock's work, and with a tremendous amount of emotional quality to it. It's like they were attacking the canvas, sort of the feelings of post-World War II America, of where they were attacking many problems. But this emotion sort of spewed forth over these canvases. They were very vital. They were very spontaneous. They were very alive. Slide, please. Pollock, unfortunately, was killed in an automobile accident at the height of his career. Some people have suggested that it may not have been an accident, that he had reached a dead end in his artistic career, and that his statement, or his life statement, had already been made. But whatever it was, toward the end of his life, he was returning to not a realistic subject matter, but subject matter was appearing again in his paintings. And we'll see a few of those later on. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. As with most artists, their early beginnings are radically different from their mature style. And the same was with Jackson Pollock in this early sort of violent seascape where the paint is slathered on in heavy impasto and in these extremely dark, sort of dreary colors. Slide, please. The sort of violence or emotional attitude has always been in his paintings. And with most of the work in the 30s and the 40s, and most of these artists in their formative years, was mostly on the abstract, and certainly a careful technique was not to be considered in the application of their paint. It was the spirit that it produced. It was the importance. Slide, please. And then in the late 30s, with some semblance toward surrealistic symbols, most of the artists came about to sort of pure abstract painting, of where there would be either symbolic motifs in their work, mostly flat colored areas, things sort of floating around, but certainly no evidence of pictorial subject matter in their work. Slide, please. Slide, please. There was also always this sort of hastily drawn quality, the linear quality to it. And in this one, almost, although the lines are drawn with a brush, you almost see where then the brush can leave the canvas and the splatter sort of extend with the excess paint dripping off the edges. But there was a spontaneity to their work that was very important to them. The analyzation came afterwards. After they had finished something, they would look at it, analyze it, find out how it would have to be changed or how it would have to be added to. Slide, please. Pollock, when you first see one, they're sort of fascinating. Because as I mentioned before, having dried on the floor, they're sort of suspended. They have a delicacy to them, like looking at a piece of lace. And then when you can actually see a real Jackson Pollock, the thickness of the paint, the texture of the paint, although a lot of them are sort of aging in color now, and I'm sure at one time, when they were first done, they were a little more crisp, maybe a little cleaner looking. But he would continually work over the surface, changing colors, letting surfaces dry, splattering new paint on top of old paint to build up this surface that he wanted. Most of the paintings grew quite large. And as I said, this notoriety, the publicity, many jokes in the New Yorker about him. There was one painting exhibited that was a fairly thin, narrow strip, sort of a reddish background with the splatters on top of it. It was something like 18 feet long, and the joke was that you could buy it by the yard. Slide, please. Also, following the Second World War, these new enamels, especially the metallic ones, lent sort of a richness to a lot of Pollock's paintings, especially the Duco enamels with the silver and the gold tints to it. Slide, please. And overlays of color, with this one a final tracery of sort of dripping white paint, capturing all the colors beneath it. Slide, please. And yet, even with this sort of accidental process, there is still some sort of control, and even in this you find sort of hidden underneath sort of directions or lines that will take your eye and move it across different areas of the composition. In looking at these, even looking at originals, Pollock in a large group can become very monotonous because it was a variation on the same theme. It was a theme stated over and over and over again. This is why most art historians feel that his return to subject matter in his later years was definitely a formative stage of another era coming. Slide, please. Slide, please. This is one of the later drawings. You'll see the face appearing in the lower right-hand portion of this slide. They're still very highly abstract, but it is a return to subject matter. These were also done in the black paint on raw canvas. So the one thing you cannot see in this slide is that as the oil paint hits the raw canvas, which is very absorbent, or an unprimed canvas, the cotton ducking the canvas itself absorbs the oil out of the paint. You have sort of a ghost image around each line. Slide, please. Slide, please. He did other things too in some movies. There's one movie on Pollock of him working, of where the camera is placed beneath a sheet of glass, and then as he splatters the paint, you can almost feel like the piece of canvas yourself. Slide, please. By the look of intensity on his face in the early photographs that we showed you at the beginning of the lecture, into his paintings, you must get the idea that he was an extremely sort of serious, almost violent sort of a man, very dedicated to his art. He was very serious about it. This is why it sort of hurt him with the publicity that he got with all the jokes made about his art. Slide, please. This is one of my favorite Pollocks, and it's one of the most important Pollocks, or most art historians, if in any retrospective show of Pollock's work would include this one. It is a dark, underpainted canvas, black, and then there were many overlays of white enamel, and then before it was finished, or before the enamel dried, the whole exterior was then smudged together and painted out white, so that it's almost like a little crack in the white window that you look through to the black underneath. Fortunately for us, this is on loan now at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Houston. It belongs to the Demonil collection, a Houston family that has a tremendous holding in contemporary art. It's a large painting, that it's even larger than you see it on the screen now. Slide, please. This is a close-up so that you can see the heavy impasto of paint, of where, in this case, it's been slathered on rather than dripped on. Slide, please. And a combination of where some compositional directions have been slathered on, and then again encased in this tracery of dripping. Slide, please. With many enamels, as with any paint, if you get it in a very liquid paint, the top surface that is exposed to the air will dry, and it will entrap wetter paint underneath it, fairly thick. So in some instances you will have sort of a crazing, or what they call an alligatoring, of as the top surface dries, The underneath surface then dries and shrinks at a slower rate, and then you'll get sort of a crinkly effect on the top. Slide, please. This one very much drawn, sort of linear black lines overlaying the color. Slide, please. Most of Pollock's work was worked on over a period of time where you allow things to dry and then go back and rework them. Some of them, I don't think we've seen any of them today, where the canvas was stained a field color first before the drippings were applied. This is a detail. Slide. Completely non-objective in most of his work. No object, no subject at all. Slide, please. Slide, please. This seems like a very calm, restful pose after the sort of nervousness of Pollock's work. But in our review, as we go back 200 years, things do change. The style of living, style of clothing, and style of painting. It would be a shame if everything had to stay the same. It wouldn't be a very exciting world knowing what each day would bring. But Copley, although Copley was never a really avant-garde artist like Pollock was in his time, many of the artists that we have studied were as extremely advanced for their period of time as Pollock is for us. But you must realize that if you think Pollock an extremely modern painter, you're slightly behind the time, because he was sort of modern back in 1940 or 1950, which was a good 25 years ago. With John Singleton Copley, he imitated, for the American taste, the English face painters. He was self-taught, had a tremendous ability at capturing surface qualities, and mostly, a few group things, but mostly portraits showing a wealthy American clientele. Slide, please. Gilbert Stuart came along in a period of history where most of his subject matter were the great or near great of a young civilization. And it sort of would be fine for a good artist or a fine artist to live in a period of such exciting happenings as Stuart did. He had the opportunity to paint Washington from life 3 different times and painted most of the other leaders of our country. Stuart, also influenced by the English face painters, developed a much more sophisticated sense of painting, softening the focus on the face, creating a greater atmosphere and a softness around the people. Mostly bust-type portraits, very few full lengths. Slide, please. A little bit later in time, George Caleb Bingham, toward the middle of the 19th century, also moved toward the middle of the United States, around the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, basing his operations out of St. Louis. Painting the life that he saw around him on the rivers, the river boatmen, the raftsmen that took things up and down the rivers. Basically, in the early part of his career, things in a parallel perspective that gave vast, sort of soft-focused landscapes behind the figures. And then toward the end of his lifetime, a much more varied composition with his political scenes, and also angling the figures so that you'd have more activity in the composition. After a tour of Dusseldorf and study there, he came back to paint the Rockies in sort of a grandiose, great grand scale. Slide, please. Thomas Eakins, in a realistic period following the Civil War, in the latter part of the 19th century, actually dissected figures to learn how the human being, the body, worked. All of his paintings are extremely accurate, anatomically, mostly with a fairly strong lighting effect so that it could cast shadows across the muscles of the figures or the faces. Extreme detail to correction of fabrics, of poses. Slide, please. James McNeill Whistler, although painting most of his time in Europe and influenced considerably by the Impressionists, was still considered himself an American. In his paintings, his portraits are elegantly subtle, smooth, beautifully done, very little harsh lighting, but a close color harmony. And his landscapes, which are very close, sort of nocturnal themes, that all of his paintings are based on abstract themes. Slide, please. Albert Pinkham Ryder was sort of the poet of the late 19th century group, with his basic subject of the boat heading toward the unknown, or illustrations from Hamlet, or Shakespeare, excuse me, and from the Bible, and also from different operas. But dark, moody pictures, detail sublimated for large areas of form. Slide, please. Winslow Homer, Homer, worked off the Maine coast and in the Bahamas. He was interested in his basic theme of man fighting nature, with it always seeming that nature was going to win. Worked in watercolor and oil. Watercolor in the Bahamas, sort of bright thing. Slide, please.